Right, what's up everybody? Gonna do another AutopsyRantz here, very similar to the style of when I first started doing videos on this channel. I want to get back to that for some of these because it's really simple, really basic. Let's just have a little bit of conversation here, alright? This one is going to be about how the government, or how the state in general, constantly grows in power. Anyone who has paid attention to any bit of history in the United States can see pretty clearly that the power balance constantly is shifting more and more in favor of government with less checks and balances from the people. And really, in all honesty, there is no real check on power. As Lysander Spooner pointed out in the mid-1800s, that the whole thing is set up to where the government actually has to check its own power. Your voting is irrelevant on government growth because we have a two-party system. And I think some people focus a little too hard on the, we need a third party, even a fourth party, we need multiple parties. I think that doesn't actually address the problem, because the problem is the government existing in the first place. A third party isn't going to change that. All you're really going to look at is splitting votes. If you can't repair one or both of the major parties now, what's to make you expect to repair a third party? And even a third party or a fourth party coming up now that might seem like has good enthusiasm, maybe even good intentions for people coming up. Once it got to the place of Republicans and Democrats, it would. What's to say that it wouldn't just fall in line to the corporate masters that the other two parties have fallen in line with? I mean, in fact, there's every incentive to do that because power attracts bad people. That's the reality of power. That's why we can't have a government. So there really is no check on power. Voting is absolutely irrelevant when it comes to government growth. As we've learned from, a lot of people that are on the smaller government side obviously tend to lean more Republican if they are going to vote for one of the major parties. And what has that got us? It hasn't got us anything. The government still constantly grows. Now, I don't know who gets the initial credit for making this statement that Republicans or conservatives are just progressives driving the speed limit, but that is one of the most brilliant and apt quotes that I've heard in modern years, because it really is the truth. And we can break this down going back to the beginning. I mean, from the very start, obviously, taxes were going to be part of this system. Even the strictest, most small government voices of the Founding Fathers, which would be like Jefferson, even Jefferson on a certain level supported taxes, and new taxes were going to have to be there. Obviously, Benjamin Franklin saying death and taxes are the two things in life you can be sure of. But let's look at how the government constantly grows, even though if you go just back to the early 1900s or the late 1800s, let's look at just how much government has grown since then and how much the voices of conserving a small government have failed to do so. And I'll eventually get back to that famous Lysander Spooner quote. But let's start with, let's see, we had taxes from the beginning. Well, let's just get right around to, I think it was in 1918, that it finally became compulsory public schooling, or compulsory education, is when it finally got around. I mean, obviously, public education in the U.S. started in like the mid-1800s, so the mid-19th century, but it became compulsory on a federal level in 1918 under Woodrow Wilson, who, of course, is an awful president. Probably, quite possibly the worst president in American history. But let's look at public schools. Okay, so when that argument had first really come around, the more smaller government, conservative type voices, whether that was Republican or Democrat is irrelevant because the parties have moved around, but the more conservative voices, we'll say the more small government voices, were opposed to this, just on the standpoint of, is it moral to compel children to go to schools? Is that a moral thing to do? Is it moral to take money from people to fund these schools? And also, just 4 or 5 years earlier than that, we got the Federal Reserve and the initiation of the first constitutionally amended income tax. So we got the 16th Amendment in this time. Whereas, obviously, Lincoln had tried to do this in the 1860s to initiate an income tax that was struck down by the Supreme Court. So the people in charge, which is the government, your masters in this country, amended the Constitution so that they could steal money out of your paycheck. So when that happened, there was a big fuss and a lot of voices saying, wait a minute, this is going way too far. Wait a minute, another central bank? That's going way too far. These public schools are going way too far. So what happens? They lost that debate. We got the Federal Reserve Act, they passed the 16th Amendment, and public schools became compulsory. Now, that one group was still fighting that for a while. But then we move on to the next thing. So the next big thing that happened was FDR's New Deal, right? So by that point, by the mid-1930s, so you're talking about less than 20 years later, those conservative voices overwhelmingly got on board with public schools, a Federal Reserve, a new central bank, and the income taxes. So when FDR comes around with these new wage and price controls and all this insane government intervention and central planning that is nowhere near in the scope of the constitutional limits on the executive branch, what did these people do? Wait a minute, Mr. FDR. We've just got on board with the public schools. We're fine with a central bank. And we're good on income taxes. But God damn it, we can't be doing these wage and price controls. And what happens? The wage and price controls stay. And then we move on to the next thing. Social Security. FDR passes Social Security. So now these guys that were on board with the public schools and the Federal Reserve System, the income tax, and if they're okay with the wage and price controls set by FDR, they're like, well, wait a minute. We're just now getting on board with all that stuff. But this Social Security thing, something seems really shady about this, that the government's going to take your money, and obviously we know what Social Security has become since the days of FDR. But they're like, well, wait a minute, there's no constitutional backing here for the federal government to provide a pension plan for retirees in their old age. What's going on here? Let's fast forward to the next thing. Eisenhower building the highway systems. Well, wait a minute. This is going to cost a whole lot of money. Now, see, that same group of conservative-type voices, these small government guys, now they're on board with public schools, they're on board with the Federal Reserve, income taxes, wage and price controls from the New Deal, all kinds of new things like minimum wages, all these hiring roadblocks that get in the way. And now they're on board with Social Security. Now they're like, hey, well, I guess we can see that because, we don't want old people eating dog food, right? But then LBJ comes along and introduces a war on poverty and Medicare and Medicaid. Now, obviously, if you know anything about this today, the bulk of government spending, it's over 2/3 of the overall spending that our government does is on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The war on poverty is just kind of an overall encompassing clusterfuck of government intervention in an attempt to help, but actually hurting. But you see, these small government guys, these were the guys that were like, God damn it, we are the brakes on the machine that is just constantly moving forward. Now they're on board with the public schools. They're fine with the Federal Reserve. At this point, they have completely accepted income taxes, the wage and price controls, Social Security. They've accepted all of that. But now they're like, well, wait a minute, Mr. Johnson, this socialized medicine stuff, this could really lead us into some big government territory. And this war on poverty could end up costing us a lot of money. Now we got to draw the line somewhere. But they don't. And eventually we get more wage and price controls, an increase in that. And by that point, by the time we get to the 1970s, these small government guys, where are they at? Now they're on board with all of those things, plus they're on board with Medicare, Medicaid, and the war on poverty. And we know this because whether it's Republican or Democrat, by the 70s, Nixon in the White House supporting wage and price controls, getting us off the gold standard. All the things Nixon did, starting the war on drugs. Where were all those small, limited government guys? And what good did they do us then? They did us no good at all. So now they've accepted all the things up till here. Now they've accepted public schools, the Federal Reserve, income taxes, wage and price controls, ×2, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, war on poverty, getting off the gold standard, and now we're going to have a national war on drugs. And then in the 70s, Jimmy Carter comes around and creates the Department of Education. Whoa, wait a minute. See, this was a thing in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was running against Carter. He ran on abolishing the Department of Education, which was newly founded. I mean, when my parents went to school, we did not have this Department of Education. But how long did it take before that became wait a minute, now we're on board with the Department of Education, and the small, restrained government guys are in favor of a Department of Education. And if you try to change that, that must mean that you want to get rid of education. What else does Ronald Reagan give us? And this is in the Reagan administration. We get a continuation of the Department of Education. We get a great expansion in overall government. And we get some of the most heavy-handed gun control laws in the history of the Republic. Where are the small government guys? Where are the let's restrain the system from getting too big? Where's that at? Now they're on board with all of those things, including a Department of Education and gun control. Let's fast forward just a little bit. In the 2000s under Bush, a Republican, what do we get? A war on terror that we're still fighting today. So now, these small government guys, these let's restrain the government guys, and when I say that, I'm talking about the people who are involved in the process, vote. They think voting Republican gets us small government. I'm talking about those people. So now by this point, we've got people, now it's not even a conversation about having public schools. The conversation now isn't even about having a federal bureau overseeing the standards of education all around the country. So we're not even having a conversation. Long gone are the conversations of should we have public education. If you think we shouldn't have a Federal Reserve or income taxes, now you are in this crazy fringe minority of people in the country, let alone having a voice in the public discussion, in the mainstream discussion. What else do we get through the Bush era? More quantitative easing from the Federal Reserve. So it's not even a conversation at all anymore. You're considered a kook if you're even questioning whether or not we should have a central bank at all. Let alone income taxes, the price controls, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty. You can't even have those conversations. And then after Bush, what do we get? We get more, well, through Bush, we get more massive Keynesian spending bills. Through Obama, we get more massive Keynesian spending bills and an even more amplified war on terror. Now, where's the conversation then? Hasn't changed one bit. We still are stuck, both parties, and the mainstream consciousness being like, yes, absolutely, public schools are okay. You're crazy for even suggesting that it's not okay. The Federal Reserve, income taxes, wage and price control, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, war on poverty, getting off the gold standard, you're wacky if you even suggest we should have a gold standard. The war on drugs is still going. We still have a Department of Education. Along comes Trump, and Trump merely even just says, well, I think the students and the parents of those students should have some kind of a say in where they go to school. And that's considered on kin with ending public education. That's considered on end of like, well, we should slightly reduce the Department of Education's control. And to most people in America, that's like, wow, he's really trying to fuck up the education system. So this is where we are. This is where those small government voices in government, conveniently, have gotten us. We have public schools. We have a Federal Reserve. We have income taxes. We have wage and price controls. We still have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty. We're still not on the gold standard. We still have the war on drugs. We still have a Department of Education. We still have increasing levels of gun control. We're still fighting the war on terror. The quantitative easing is never going away. Interest rates are still at zero, and they spend like fucking crazy. We're still getting massive Keynesian spending bills. So where are we at? We didn't get any kind of restraint on government. And this takes me to the Lysander Spooner quote. Quote, "Whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain. It has either authorized such a government as we have had, or it has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. This is why government constantly grows. It constantly grows because a piece of paper from the 18th century cannot resist tyranny. Voting has changed absolutely nothing. It has done nothing to restrain the growth of government, which has been constant, as I pointed out here. And the definition of insanity is to continue doing the same things and expecting different results."